Good evening, everyone. My name is Omer Bartov. I'm a professor of the History Department, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Professor Alon Confino, whom I've known for many years, since our years together at Tel Aviv University. I will very briefly introduce him to you because I'd like him to have sufficient time to talk. Professor Confino received his first degree at Tel Aviv University in 1985, and his PhD from Berkeley in 1992. He started off as a German historian, and his first book, which had a great deal of impact on many German historians and beyond, The Nation as Local Metaphor, a book that considered the notion of Heimat, which certainly resonates also with topics that he's writing on now, was published in 1997. He published his second book, Germany as a Culture of Remembrance, in 2006, and The Holocaust as Historical Understanding in 2012. The book that he will be talking about now was recently published in 2014, The Nazi Imagination. I'd like to add that since the publication of that book, he's been concerned with issues that move from Europe to the Middle East, and he's been writing a new book about 1948. Seen from the perspective of both Jewish Israelis, or those who became Israelis, and Palestinians. All these books, in many ways, consider a similar theme from very different perspectives that have to do with memory, with culture, with identity, and we're thinking about history not only as what happened in the past, but also very much about how people not only remember the past, but how they experienced it from their own perspectives. So with this, I'll call Professor Confino to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Omer. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for coming this evening. And I'd like to thank the Department of Judaic Studies, the History Department, and the Watson Center, and especially Omer Bartov for this introduction, for this invitation. I summoned from the historical record a scene, an experience that was as exhilarating as it was marked by this intense combination of audacity and transgression. In Berlin, Germans burned the Torah scrolls of the Hebrew Bible in front of the Levetzow Street Synagogue, while others carried the rolls from the Fazalen Street Synagogue to Wittenberg Square and burned them there. By fire and other means, a festive, expressive destruction of the Book of Books was at the center of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, when on November 9th, 1938, 1,400 synagogues were set on fire in Nazi Germany. In the small town of Fritzlar, in Hessen, Torah scrolls were rolled along the Nikolaus Street as Hitler Youth rode their bikes over them. In Aachen, Nazis torn the Torah in front of the synagogue and put scraps of papers in their pocket, claiming it brings good luck. In Vienna, now part of the Reich, Jews, dressed in the robe and decorations of the Ark, were marched and chased in downtown streets with torn Torah scrolls tied to their backs. Whereas in Frankfurt, Jews were forced to tear the Torah themselves and then burn it. In Württemberg, a man who picked up in the street tattered Jewish prayer books, presumably as an act of respect, was later hanged publicly on the way on a tree from Steinach to Halle. As Torah scrolls burned in a synagogue yard in Düsseldorf, German men, some wearing the robes of the rabbis and cantors, danced around the fire. Why did the Nazis burn the Hebrew Bible? This is a good question, because in European Christian civilization, the burning of the Bible is bound to be significant. However we choose to understand it, the act demands an explanation. But the scholarship on Kristallnacht and the Holocaust, as well as general accounts of the Third Reich, has not made this event part of the story. This silence, too, deserves an explanation. So is the historian fantasizing? Or should we instead ask not only why did the Nazis burn the Bible, but also what are the serious doubts this case raises about current narratives of the Holocaust? Also because the sources I used to reconstruct the burning of the Bible are known. I would have liked to tell you that I found them in a little cellar, that they were dusty, and it was a very dangerous expedition into the Black Forest in Germany, a little bit like Hogwarts, you know. Alas, they are all published. They are testimonies of Jews and others collected shortly after Kristallnacht that have been since available in the Wiener Library in London. When I first encountered these sources, I read them with shock that such a radical event took place, with surprise that it has not been made part of Holocaust history, and with uncertainty as to how to integrate the event into such a history. So let us keep these scenes in mind as we try to explore this historical case. Recent accounts of the Third Reich, however sophisticated, do not pose the question, why did the Nazis burn the Hebrew Bible? Because they view the Nazi racial ideology as the fundamental source of the motivation, beliefs, and values that led to the Holocaust. According to this view, Nazi motivation sprang from the aim to build a racial biological society. There is no doubt about the fundamental importance of racial ideology to understanding Nazism. But the anti-Jewish identity the Nazis created was more complex. In burning the Bible, the Nazis directed their wrath against a religious, not a racial symbol. Other dominant directions in Holocaust research have also not been helpful. Viewing the Germans' motivation as embedded in the administrative state process of extermination, culminating in Auschwitz. This view has explored in meticulous detail the bureaucratic machinery of the German state that made the Holocaust possible, from the trains used to deport the Jews to the working of the camps. Another important approach emphasized the brutalization of the Second World War, which led the German soldiers to perpetrate mass murders. Scholarship on these topics certainly helps us to understand aspects of the Holocaust. It is very important, but it cannot assist us in interpreting the burning of the Bible. When we consider the Holocaust as emerging from racial ideology and a state-run administrative process during a brutal war, it becomes difficult to place Kristallnacht and the burning of the Bible within this framework. It does not fit, because race and religion, which have often been viewed as separate categories, commingled in Kristallnacht. Because by burning the Bible, Germans conveyed a preoccupation with ancient roots and moral authority that cannot make sense within an exclusively racial explanation. And because the dramatic burning of a book, holy also to Christianity, seems hardly revealing about the extermination of Jews in the death camps. The point is not that racial and other accounts of the Third Reich portray Kristallnacht inadequately, but that the history of the persecution and extermination of the Jews holds together much better once Kristallnacht is excluded. The burning of the Bible does not fit in these accounts. A world of meaning is lost when these views of racial ideology, the brutal war, and the state-run process of extermination dominate our understanding of the Holocaust. Because the question, why did the Nazis burn the Hebrew Bible, demands a historical imagination that captures Germans' culture and sensibilities. When we change our perspective and view the burning of the Bible as part of the creation by Nazis and other Germans of a new German identity, when we acknowledge that this act involved a set of emotions that cannot be ignored or separated from the Holocaust, then new possibilities that challenge our perceptions emerge to help us understand the Holocaust. Burning the Bible was an intentional act. It happened all over Germany, in public, for all to see. And both those who perpetrated the act and those who watched it perceived it as a transgression, whether they supported or opposed the burning. The act was part of a larger story Germans told themselves during the Third Reich about who they were, where they came from, how they had arrived there, and where they were headed. It is this story I'm after in my book and also this evening in my talk. A story about a journey in time, then. I ask myself, how has the notion of time been overall considered in the current dominant interpretations of the Holocaust? The interpretative Holy Trinity of the historiography of the Third Reich is now defined by the terms empire, race, and space, and with very good reasons. This new framework has tremendously enriched our understanding of the Nazi period by interpreting the Nazi expansion in Europe as a colonial project, by placing the Holocaust within comparative genocide studies and within the Nazi vast programs of exterminations, and by locating the Nazi venture to conquer Europe and perhaps the entire world within the context of empire buildings in modern European history overall. And thus, by combining colonialism, race, and empire, scholars have turned space into a key category to understand Nazi ideology, policy of expansion, and projects of annihilation. There can be no doubt about the fundamental contribution of this body of work. And yet, there is one element that is rather missing from this picture, the element of time. Nazi spatial policy was revolutionary, an empire devoted to expansion from the Atlantic in the west to the Pacific shores of Siberia in the east, and to annihilation of whole groups of people. What then, I ask, was the revolutionary concept of time that accompanied this revolutionary policy of space? The scholarship is quite silent on this issue. What was the imagination of time and of history that gave meaning and legitimacy to this radical spatial genocidal policy? Things began to fall into place. Nazism's apocalyptic vision, I thought, was about crafting a new creation that by extension demanded a new historical origins. For Germans, in 1938, the Bible represented, among others, Jewish and Christian traditions and past. In burning the Bible, Germans expressed conceptions of historical time and origins. My argument in A World Without Jews is that representations of the past, of origins to be exact, underlie the Nazi perception of time, building of empire, and extermination of the Jews. For the Nazis, the Jews symbolized time. Their persecution and extermination was driven by the desire to control memory and history. Nazism was an act of creation of a new society, a racial civilization to mold Germany, Europe, and the world based on systematic persecution and extermination of groups of people. Precisely because it saw itself as a radical, novel historical departure, Nazism paid particular attention to the past, that protean, an essential factor of life in all societies. This view fit within a broader pattern of all national and revolutionary movements in the modern world that sought to build a new life based on invented and constructed recollections. In the modern world, and since Nazi biological worldview was based on the idea of origins that cannot be mutated, ideas of the past became fundamental to endow the movement with that legitimacy and authenticity that come with roots. The Jews symbolized for the Nazis origins that had to be extirpated for the Nazi Germany to arise. The idea of the Jew as possessors of origin, of the present, the past, and the future, of modernity, the nation, and ultimately humanity, was the basis for the empire of time and for the fantasy that made persecution and extermination of the Jews possible. The Jews represented three registers of time that were prominent in three different stages of the Third Reich, and that together made up a Nazi narrative of history. We begin in 1933. Immediately after the seizure of power, the Jews epitomized a certain kind of modernity whose un-German alien elements had to be cleansed from German society. The adjective Jüdisch or Jewish was attached to every phenomenon of the modern world objectionable to the Nazis, and then some. The Jews were responsible for Bolshevism, communism, Marxism, socialism, liberalism, conservatism, pacifism, cosmopolitanism, materialism, atheism, and democracy. For the defeat in the First World War, the 1918 November Revolution that brought the Weimar Republic into being, and for the Republic itself. For Weimar's culture of entertainment in the cabaret and club scene, as well as for sexual freedom, psychoanalysis, feminism, homosexuality, and abortions. For modernist, atonal, and jazz music, for Bauhaus architecture, and for abstract painting represented in Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Cubism, Dadaism, Expressionism, and probably I missed something along the way, but I think you get the picture. The persecution of the Jews in the early years of the Third Reich was thus tied up with an anti-Marxist and anti-liberal vision of modernity shared by Nazis, but by many other Germans as well who were not Nazis. This vision was not anti-modern. It proposed a different modernity built on the ruins of communism, liberalism, and Jewish influences. It was the Jews who represented the overall meaning of the Nazi revolution, the crushing of one modernity and the making of another, because only they represented in the minds of the Nazis at one and the same time different and often opposing enemies. They could represent Marxism and liberalism, democracy and Bolshevism. Differently put, they represented the whole that was bigger than the sum of its parts. The Nazis thus created the Jews as a symbolic manual for an evil modernity. The notion of race had a central place in the Nazi idea of origins. Studies of the last 2 decades, as we have already said, have conclusively shown both the key place of racial ideology in the Third Reich, as well as the complex application of this idea. Not even the Nazis knew exactly what racial identity meant. And the use of the notion of race was a work of progress, of an evolving concept rather than an imposition by the regime of clear set of ideas. One result of this detailed historiography has been to acknowledge the importance of race in the Third Reich, while making the true but bland observation that, well, it was all much more complicated than that. Did the concept of race in the Third Reich have a common denominator that linked among its complex and diverse applications while connecting it to main identities in German society? I suggest viewing Nazi racial ideas from the perspective of the idea of origins. The biological worldview claimed that the history of humankind is a story of racial conflict, and that the characteristics of racial groups were predetermined and could not be fundamentally changed. Race theories did leave some possibilities for change, but you could not convert yourself from being Jewish to being Aryan. There were some limits. By turning race into the principal idea of Germany, the notion of race became the metaphor of origins in the Third Reich. The Nazi transformed the notion of origins into the fundamental aspect of their policies, mentalities, and beliefs. And still, the notions of race and of the origins of modernity cannot quite come close to constructing a revolutionary idea, of time, able to carry symbolically the expansionist and genocidal aims of the Nazis, an idea that is represented in the Jews that would destroy a key part of current German and European civilization and ushering a new one. This, I would like to argue, happened on November 9th, 1938, when the Nazis burned the Hebrew Bible. Having in mind the dominant interpretation of racial ideology as the ultimate motivation for Nazi anti-Semitism, I ask a simple question. Why did the Nazis, set on constructing a racial civilization, burn in Kristallnacht the Bible and synagogues, which are holy religious symbols? This, I contend, was part of the Nazi idea of the Jew as possessors of origins that threatened the Third Reich. 1933 placed the Jews as the origins of a certain present that Nazism sought to replace. The burning of the Bible and of the synagogues placed the Jews as the origin of a certain past that, soiling the German land, had to be completely erased. Burning the synagogues was not targeted at Jews as liberals or Bolsheviks, and also not as racial enemies, but instead at Jews as possessors of origins embedded in the text that was perhaps the symbol of roots in European Christian civilization. Burning the Bible was a Nazi transgressive act against the key symbol of their own culture, transgressive but also liberating. The Nazis claimed a new national identity that owed nothing to the symbolic authority of the Jews derived from the Bible, but also owed nothing to previous moral and cultural constraints in treating other Christian Europeans. It was not an anti-Christian project, as it was a project to construct a new German Christianity that owed nothing to the Jews and to other Christian Europeans. Had the Nazis limited their aims to narrow political change from Weimar democracy to dictatorship, then removing the Jews from political, economic, and social positions, and as indeed happened after 1933, would have been enough. But their aim was to found a racial civilization, a new humanity, and this demanded a new register of historic time that linked the origins embedded in the idea of race, of Christianity, and of history. In this sense, Kristallnacht, strictly speaking, was not against Jews at all. It was against Judaism. For all intents and purposes, it eliminated Judaism from Germany for the first time since centuries, even while remnants of Jews still lived in Germany for the time being. The final evolution of the Nazi time as represented in the Jews came at the war, articulated in the idea, I quote, "The Jewish question is the key to world history," as the Reich Press Office announced on February 3rd, 1944. By that time, the vast Nazi project of treating whole groups of people as people without rights, of labor and concentration camps, and of genocides did create a new humanity, which was perceived by contemporaries as a new history, radically different from what had been experienced up until then. The Jews were again at the center of the making of the Nazi empire and the Nazi identity. It was their extermination that gave it meaning as being experientially unprecedented. Heinrich Himmler expressed this sentiment in his notorious address to a group of SS officers in Posen in 1943. "In our history," he said, "the extermination of the Jews is an unwritten and never to be written page of glory." Oskar Rosenfeld, a Viennese Jew who was deported to the Lodz ghetto in November 1941 and kept a remarkable diary, wrote, "There are no heroes in this tragedy." And why tragedy? Because the pain does not touch on something human, on a strange heart, but on something incomprehensible that touches on the cosmos, an event in nature like the creation of the world. "In the beginning," he wrote, mixing metaphors of origins from the Old and the New Testaments, "in the beginning, God created the ghetto." What was the idea that undergirded the total extermination of the Jews and gave it meaning? I turned to listen to Nazis, to other Germans, to Jews and Europeans, to read their letters, diaries, speeches, and other sources. They imagined the extermination of the Jews as an act of creation, in a sense of Genesis, in which the Jewish world would be destroyed to make space for the Nazi one. As an act of creation, the extermination was perceived as producing a cosmic result, either salvation or eternal damnation. As being a human experience, and it was perceived also as being a human experience that lacked historical precedence, as every creation is by definition. And as such, it was perceived as a transgression in the sense that it was a violation of all past known experience. The notion of creation was the organizing metaphor used for Jews, Germans, and Europeans to make sense of what was happening to the Jews after 1941. It allowed contemporaries to represent a radical rupture, for a Genesis has no roots in the past, while at the same time it fit within the Nazi evolving imagination since 1933. However radical the extermination was then, it shared similarities with the German cultural imagination of the preceding years. There was an inner sense to the Nazi persecution and extermination of the Jews, for the progressive removal of Jews meant the conquering of time, of the present in 1933 through their exclusion from German society, of a moral past in 1938 through the elimination of Judaism and the Bible, and ultimately of history, and therefore of the future, in 1941 through the extermination from the face of the earth of the Jews as the source of all historical evil. The idea of Genesis described the symbolic urgency of the Nazis to kill all the Jews immediately. And so, once again, as in 1933 and 1938, the Jews were at the center of the making of Nazi life, it was their extermination that gave meaning to the Nazi empire. Looking at the clock. So, the interpretation I just presented to you, and that is presented in my book, should be placed alongside other accounts that emphasize political, military, ideological, and other kind of histories. Research on the Holocaust has become so vast now that it is a big enough tent for different interpretations that shed light on the Holocaust from various aspects. And they are, of course, important, these various aspects. I told one story. And still, the story I told does differ in some key points from current interpretations of the Holocaust. And so I would like to articulate these differences. I've already pointed out that I reject the dominant interpretations of racial ideology as the ultimate source of motivation. Nazi persecution was embedded in racial ideas, no doubt, but also in Christian religious sentiments, as well as national sentiments embodied in the national idea of Heimat or homeland. They all made into the Nazi imagination of the idea of origins. A fundamental problem in interpreting the Holocaust has been how to explain the daunting gap between the anti-Jewish persecution of the pre-war years and the almost unimaginable extermination during the war. If we look for Auschwitz in pre-war Nazi culture, we assume that Auschwitz was already clearly imaginable, which was not the case. If we emphasize racial ideology, we assume a causal relation that explains too little because it's still not clear how the jump was made from hatred to extermination. I attempt to show how imagination in the 1930s anticipated the 1940s, anticipated extermination in the 1940s, by following the way Germans imagined a world without Jews. This is the leading metaphor that drives our story. Our starting point is the intention of the Nazis and the policy of the German state, started on January 30th, 1933, when Hitler assumed power. The construction of a Germany and later a world without Jews. This perspective captures the search in the Third Reich for a Germany without Jews, while taking cognizance of the different policies, such as emigration or segregation, different opinions and sentiment of the project, its complexity, probability, and uncertainty. Some supported the idea, some opposed it, while some were left indifferent. But it was and remained a goal of the Third Reich from the beginning, a whole larger than the sum of Germans' views about the Jews. As we follow the story of a Germany without Jews in the 1930s, we are not required to know the story's final destination, the extermination in Auschwitz. In fact, we ought to follow the story in much the same way the Germans did after 1933, when they did not know where their imagination would lead them. Our only firm point is January 30th, 1933. A moral, historical, post-Enlightenment break was made then, not by planning an eventual extermination, but by thinking that a German world without Jews could be a reality, somehow. Placing the imagination of a Germany without Jews at the center of the history of the Holocaust means shifting the focus from a story that ends in Auschwitz to the gradual making of a culture in which Germany, and later a world without Jews, made sense to Germans. It is jarring to speak about making sense of the Holocaust, but it is the right phrase and the right investigation if we wish to uncover how Germans made sense of their world in the Third Reich, however morally objectionable this world is to us. Made sense also does not mean that everybody agreed to it. Rather, it means the Germans were able to imagine it, to internalize it, to making part of their vision of the present and the future, whether they agreed, opposed, or were indifferent to it. Because, in reality, it is not Auschwitz that stands at the center of the historian's study of Nazi anti-Semitism, but the making of a German world without Jews. I stand by this claim. Imagining this world was not a consequence of the war. Auschwitz was. The idea of a Germany without Jews had been in the process of being realized already before the war, from 1933. It would have been created with or without Auschwitz. How did it settle in Germans' imagination? The imagination of a Germany without Jews links anti-Semitic actions and ideas in the pre-war and war years because it describes anti-Semitism as a work in progress. I thus challenge the mainstream view in popular and scholarly understanding of the Holocaust, that the mass murder of the Jews during the war had not been anticipated, that victims and perpetrators alike scarcely believed what was happening, that it was unimaginable and unrepresentable. Primo Levi, to my mind, the greatest contemporary to write about the Holocaust, expressed this idea in one of the 20th century's most profound short statements. Today, at this very moment, as I sit writing at the table, I myself am not convinced that these things really happened. The sentiment cannot be denied. At the same time, historians know that all that happened was, in some way, somehow imagined. Not literally, not exactly, but it was put into images and words that made it possible. No historical event springs from thin air. None is unique because this implies no relations to context, to past, to present. Of course, on November 9th, 1938, no one could imagine the gas chamber of Auschwitz, not even Hitler. But on that day, one could imagine a German world in which Jews and Judaism were terminated by fire and violence. Our aim is to seek patterns of meaning and purpose in a world of fantasies that made the extermination possible precisely because it was somehow imaginable and representable. Finally, the Holocaust cannot be understood without consideration of the history of European colonialism and of racial ideas about inferior groups who had no right to live. The Holocaust can be understood only when placed within the comparative history of modern genocides. It belongs squarely within the genre of genocides and was not an exceptional stand-alone historical event. But in themselves, European traditions of modern colonialism and racial ideas cannot account for the Holocaust. And at some point, I part ways with the scholarship on comparative genocides and the Nazi Empire. Some scholars question in various ways the extent to which the Holocaust was central to understanding National Socialism. In making the Nazi Empire, some argue, the Holocaust was a result rather than a goal of Nazism, growing out of the specific circumstances of the war. Others integrate the Holocaust into a history of totalitarian genocides committed by Hitler and Stalin in Eastern Europe, implying that the Holocaust was a result of the linked policies of the two dictators as they push each other to commit ever-worsening crimes. The limits of these arguments should also be made clear. If the Holocaust was a result of the mass murders in Eastern Europe between Hitler and Stalin, why did the Nazis choose to exterminate the Jews of Corfu, and by extension of Western Europe, who had no direct relation to this conflict? If the Holocaust was essentially only part of mass murders, such as the premeditated starvation of Ukrainian peasants by Stalin in the early 1930s, then why was it that Stalin's secret police did not seek to kill all Ukrainians in the Soviet Union, or indeed the world, whereas the Gestapo searched for every single Jew in occupied Europe to be murdered, and, beyond that, asked the king of Bulgaria and the Sultan of Morocco to hand over to the Nazis their Jews in order to send them to Auschwitz. Both rulers refused. The problem with the arguments that the Holocaust was not central to understanding National Socialism is that they view a close description of the circumstances of the Second World War, that is, of what happened, as an explanation of what people believed and imagined, that is, of why things happened. According to this view, implicitly and at times explicitly, anti-Jewish sensibilities were not of major importance in the making of the Holocaust. I wonder about that. Empire building, multiple genocides, and other wartime circumstances cannot account for Germans' culture and motivations. Much as the Nazi immigration policies to push the Jews out of Germany before November 1938, as one historian argues, cannot account for the burning of the Bible. My view is different. The Holocaust should be placed within a history of Nazi war and occupation, empire building, and comparative genocide. The Holocaust was not unique, but it was perceived during the war as unique by Germans, Jews, and other Europeans. And if we want to understand the Holocaust, and if we want to understand why it happened, we ought to explain this. The comparative approach to genocide sharpens the similarities, but also the differences between the Holocaust and other genocides. On the one hand, the idea of exterminating racial groups has been building in European culture and politics for a century before the Third Reich. But on the other hand, it is evident that for the Nazis, the persecution and extermination of the Jews was more urgent and historically significant than other genocides they committed. Although they set out to kill all the Jews immediately during the war, they did not have such a policy for other groups of victims. This only begs the question, why did the Nazis view the extermination of the Jews as so urgent and fatal to their survival? Why did Germans, Jews, and Europeans perceive during the war the extermination of the Jews as unlike any other genocide perpetrated by the Nazis? My answer has been that for the Nazis and other Germans, Jews represented time, symbolizing evil historical origins that had to be eradicated for Nazi civilization to arise. We end then where we began, with a story about a journey in time. So let me conclude with some brief thoughts on this. The Nazi project was built on commingling opposite views of the past, building a revolutionary new civilization by looking forward and backward at the same time. They used Christian tradition of anti-Semitism while working to undermine that Christianity by eliminating the Jews. They exterminated the Jews to create a new civilization with a new morality, while accepting the old civilization axiom that Jews are bearer of some essential truth. They set out to annihilate the Jews because they accepted this essential truth. In justifying the annihilation, they mixed ancient and moral beliefs, old anti-Semitic Christian tradition, and contemporary racial and national ideas. These dualities were complementary, not contradictory. And so, on the one hand, I belong to a group of historians who believe that one cannot understand the Holocaust without putting at the center the question, why the Jews? But on the other hand, my interpretation is fundamentally different from some trends in anti-Semitism approach to the Holocaust that argue, explicitly or implicitly, that an accumulation of an ancient hatred through the centuries paved the way and ultimately produced the Holocaust. I argue the opposite. It is not that the past of anti-Semitism produced the present. It is not that the past of anti-Semitism produced the present of the extermination. Not that the ancient hatred led to the Holocaust, but that the Nazis interpreted anew the past of Jewish, German, and Christian relations to fit their vision of creating a new world. It is the Nazis who made sense of and gave meaning to past anti-Semitism, not so much the other way around. It is always people in the present who give meaning to the past. The past itself can never give meaning to a future not yet born. The result, I believe, is a new interpretation of the nexus between history of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. I argue that while the history of anti-Semitism did not lead inevitably to the Holocaust, we equally cannot understand the Holocaust without explaining how the Nazis crafted an imagination of a future civilization that fundamentally owes to Western ideas and traditions of anti-Judaism. The Germans could conceive, justify, and imagine the persecution and extermination of the Jews because their ideas of Jews and Judaism in the Third Reich was part of a rich, familiar, symbolic universe of past anti-Semitism and Christian-Jewish relations. For the past, and here I conclude, as we all know, is being capable of being appropriated by the most unexpected hands. And people have a remarkable ability to change, to adapt, and to make it part of their life in the most creative and astonishing ways. About memory, we can only know one thing for certain. It will continue to be predictably unpredictable, and we turn our predictions upside down and inside out. Nazis and other Germans then did exactly what we do. They built their identity by using present-day ideas, mixing and matching, picking and choosing, creating stories about themselves based on facts, imagination, and invention. Telling stories makes us human, but not all our stories are humane. Stories give life, and stories kill as well.
Thank you. You take questions? Can you?
Of course.
You want to do it yourself? Okay. Please.
Yes, please.
Your story of Kristallnacht as a narrative of origins sounds really compelling. But it also reminds me of the French Revolution, who you remember also tried to annihilate Christian time and create a new civilization based on completely new ideas. How would you distinguish between these two events?
I would say that many revolutionary movements in the modern world try to have a new historic time. The Bolshevik Revolution, the French Revolution, the Nazis, the Chinese, also the Iranian Revolution. The whole idea that something new is coming out and you have to break from the past. You have to legitimize your newness. So in that sense, I think the Nazi Revolution, we should put it in this broad genre of events, modern revolutions. The French revolutionaries wanted to create a new secular, rational, Enlightenment style time. So they had a work week of 10 days. One reason why the people would not accept it, of course. If you want the work days, make 5 days. But as we know that after a short time, it didn't lead to much. I would say that in Kristallnacht, the idea was not to create a new calendar. I mean, the French revolutionaries actually had a new calendar with new names, and here it was not about, although the Nazis had also an idea of a new calendar, but it didn't pick up. But it was not so much a new calendar as it was a new reading of history. So in that sense, I can say, I can think about the Bolshevik Revolution that had now a new reading of the past, of the Russian past, and how we position ourselves in front of it. So I would say in this way. Yes.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for the speech. It was really, really interesting work that you're doing. I'm really interested in this idea of time and the kind of rewriting of it, but I think you would agree that one does not simply just kind of replace history, right? You don't just forget history and start afresh.
Right.
And so I'm wondering, in the research that you did, how much of a self-consciousness was there about starting a new Nazi world, a new time period, from on the foundations of the old? How much of that was an attempt to suppress the past, and how much of that was a self-conscious, look what we did, we conquered this, and this is another part of our conquest?
Yeah, so let me maybe say also a few words about where did I take this idea. So for many years I worked in the field that is called memory studies. That is the idea that people remember the past not in order to get it right, but in order to get it wrong, in order to build their own identity. And in that sense, societies and individuals have some similarities. Also when we look at our past, when we are 20, 30, 40, 50, we look at our past differently. Not because we lied before, but because events that at the age of 20 did not seem to us so important, perhaps when we are 40, we have a completely different understanding of them. Maybe when we become parents, we understand something that our parents did, and when we were in college, we thought that our parents are really stupid, and then we become 40, and we said, you know what, maybe they had a point. So we tell ourselves stories, and we change our stories as we go along. So my investigation, basically, what I was curious about is, what is the story the Nazis told themselves about the past? Because especially when you do bad things, you want to have a very good past to go along with it. And when people kill other people, rarely they say, yes, I killed, I'm a bad guy, I'm a really evil person. No, people say I killed and it was justified. It was justified to exterminate all this village because, and then they have a lot of... So I was after this story, in that sense, the memory story, that in the last generation, memory studies has been a very important field of research. So as I said at the end, and as you correctly said, we never erase the past completely. There isn't such a thing, not in personal life and not in... we always take the past with us. Either we acknowledge it, or we repress it, or we emphasize different things. Societies do the same. What I think is fascinating about the Nazis, and what my argument is, that they are so radical because on the one hand, they took so much from the past, and on the other hand, they changed so much. So let's take Christianity, for example. On the one hand, they take one of Christianity's main ideas, that the Jews are bearers of some truth. On the other hand, they are going to kill all the Jews, which will make a wholly new Christianity. Actually, I end the book. Actually, I have a few endings of the book. I really liked my book, so I couldn't depart from it. A few endings. So one of the endings that how Europe would look like had the Nazis won the war and exterminated all the Jews. Presumably, Michelangelo's David would be taken away from Piazza della Signoria, and the Sistine Chapel would be painted over, at least the biblical scenes. And what would the Pope do? A Christianity without Jews. This is a completely different Christianity. It breaks the Augustinian vouch for the Jews. Augustinus, who said that Christianity should keep the Jews because they were witness to the Messiah. Anti-Semitism, Christian anti-Semitism is about converting the Jews, not about killing them. So this is, they used part of the tradition of anti-Judaism, but they also added to it racial element, modern elements. So they created their own stories. They were people of the 30s and the 40s. That's why I reject the idea that accumulation of anti-Semitism produced the Holocaust. Because we always tell the story of our past from the present. We are 20, we are 30, we are 40, we tell our story from then. We go back. So they looked at their past from the point of view of people in the 30s and 40s. They used what they wanted, and they crafted it into, yeah.
I have a clear picture from your talk of what the problem with the contemporary Jews was, right? Because they were bringing all these terrible modern art and politics and everything like that. I'm still trying to get a sense as to, historically, what was the problem with the Christianity that had Jewish origins? What was it that, the historical objection to the Jews, I mean, how conscious were they of it? How developed and articulated was it? What was it about that it would seem to be, and therefore, I get a sense that because of history, that's why you really have to kill them, because they've just been such a problem all along. But what was it about in the past that why have a Christianity without a Jewish origin?
So let me say something about explicit articulations and then about implicit articulations. It's a very important. So explicitly, for example, the Nazis created a new field of studies, Judenforschung, studies about the Jews, in which they showed, these were all scholars in universities, in which they showed the evil influence of the Jews along history, and especially how the Jews infiltrated the German body and society, body politics. And because they infiltrated so much, we have now to separate them. Because we have to kill the Jews, not because they are far away from us, but because they are part of us. If you're far away, who cares? This is also this duality. We have to kill the Jews because they are part of us. That's why they are so important. The Poles are not part of us in the same way that the Jews are. So there is this Judenforschung as a historical, interdisciplinary field of research to show why the Jews are bad. Okay, now about Christianity. So in 1939, a new institution was founded by the Nazis. It has this long German title, something like the Institution for the Eradication of Jewish Influence in German Society. It's a theological institution. It has some of the best theologians in Germany, who have the best university chairs, very important people, who also contributed a great deal to Christian theology in the 19th, 20th century. Some of them are great scholars, but they joined it, and their project was to show that Jesus was an Aryan, that he was not Jewish. And therefore, we need to take the Jews out of Christianity. Now, here, the Nazis built actually on a tradition in Protestantism that was not anti-Semitic. From the last third of the 19th century, there are very important Christian theologians, most of them Protestant, but there are also some Catholics, but most of them Protestant, who say Judaism and Christianity are two different religions. Judaism is the religion of the Father, this angry God, and Jesus is a good guy. And they are not anti-Semitic, they are important. So the Nazis built on this, only they add, as everything. They build on European civilization. They didn't come from the moon. But they add the racial idea. So Jesus was an Aryan. And this institute was also charged with the task of creating a new Christian rituals. What's the word I'm looking for? Liturgy. For a Christianity without Jews. So in 1940, they published a New Testament, which takes out all positive references to the Jews. They take out that Jesus was part of the house of David, and they make Jesus into a virile, soldier-like Nazi guy. That's what they added. And this is a New Testament, and it is sold 200,000 copies in the Third Reich. Now, I don't want to say that everybody believes, clearly not, but we can think of what the Nazis would have perhaps done had they won the war. Now, just a very short thing. So, now about the implicit thing. So many people ask me, so you are saying that all the Germans believed it, that it is a culture of consent. There is now a forum on my book, and a very distinguished German historian, Helmut Schmidt, wrote that my book is about a culture of consent, and he thinks that it's not like this, that everybody believed. I did not write about whether Germans were Nazis, or how much Germans were Nazis, or were Germans really Nazis, because what does really mean? I was not interested to contribute to this very important historiography, that it is important. I didn't think that I have anything to contribute. I looked at it from a different direction, and I want to explain it by thinking a minute about America in 1860. In America in 1860, whether you were a slaveholder or an abolitionist, you could imagine slavery. You can be an abolitionist only if you can imagine slavery. If you can't imagine slavery, you cannot be an abolitionist, according to my view. Today, I think here in America, now in this room, we cannot imagine slavery in the sense we cannot imagine a human being who will be our property, bought and sold. Of course, we can read about it, we can watch movies, but not in that sense of. I wrote the history of an imagination in a specific time and place. And when was this imagination available? The imagination was a Germany without Jews. It was not Auschwitz. It was not extermination. In order to be against this policy of the state, whether it is Jewish persecution or Jewish extermination, you have to imagine it. My book, indeed, is not about, it doesn't get into a sociological analysis of who was for and who was against, but it is a history of the production, of the availability of this imagination in German society. So this is about an implicit thing that we breathe, the values that we breathe in a certain culture without even thinking about them. That's what I was after. Something more subtle than explicit utterances. I'm Nazi, I'm not Nazi. When you grew up in Germany, when it was 1940-41, you imagined Germany without Jews. In 1940-41, the last Jews are being deported to the east from German communities. There are these marches. They are silent marches. There is no violence. And I describe them in my book. These are marches that I interpret. These people, the Germans, know this is the end of Judaism in Germany. That's it. We burned our synagogues. The others left to Palestine or to America. And here are the last Jews, and they are transported for new life to resettlement in the East with one suitcase in tow. After 10 years of persecution, do we really think that these people will resettle with one suitcase? So, when Germans said after the war they did not know about Auschwitz, I believe them. I don't get into the discussion, did you know about Auschwitz or not? Probably you didn't. But when you saw this march, now it's not that everybody sees and immediately starts to think, but you, and then of course I also give testimonies and what the people said, that a lot of people in the community understood exactly that this is the end of Judaism in German history. So you don't need to know about Auschwitz. That's where I'm getting at. Yes.
I have a quite short question.
I hope my answer will not be long. The problem is not with the answers, it's not with the question, it's with my answers.
So, would you say that after the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, that the destruction of European Jewry was inevitable?
Absolutely not. That's very, very short answer.
I'm satisfied.
Absolutely not. That's precisely what I'm trying not to argue, and I'm very adamant about it. And that's why the metaphor of, I call my book a world, so some scholars chided me for not calling the book a German world without Jews. They are right. But you know what? A German world without Jews is such a clunky title. A world without Jews, that's, in 4 words you have the whole thing. You don't even need to read my book. You already know what's a... Good titles are short. So a German world without Jews meant first we're going to take them out of the university, of the law firm, of our neighborhoods, of our schools. No one thought about, no, absolutely not. But this imagination that somehow they have to be moved is built. And then in the certain circumstances of the war, when it becomes an imperial war, a world war, when we have all these Jews now under our command, what are we going to do with them? So it's not.
We'll have to close soon, so I'm going to ask a question.
Yes.
Just one thing before I ask, which is about the German church that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
The idea of an Aryan Christ. As you know, a fair amount of the scholarship about this shows that Hitler was particularly uninterested in that phenomenon. He really was not interested in making Christ Aryan or anything of the sort, and he wasn't much interested in the churches. But that's beside the point. I have 2 questions that I wanted to raise. One has to do with the notion of burning the Bible, and the other with the world without Jews. And here's a story, because you're telling stories. So the story is that in 1982, a group of Israeli writers was visiting Munich, and they were very sort of troubled being in Germany. They had all gone to Germany for the first time. It was uneasy for them, and they went to visit the museum. And in the museum, the director of the museum wanted to show them his most cherished possession, and that was a Talmud. And they asked him, a Talmud from, I don't know, the 11th century or something, and they asked him, you have a Talmud as your most cherished possession? What happened to it during the war under the Nazis? And he said, well, when there was the bombing, we really worried about it. What would happen to it? So we took it out of the museum, we hid it in a monastery in the countryside so that it would be preserved. Now, as you know, Munich is right next to Dachau. The idea was that the Talmud was much more cherished than the Jews. And I'm curious about this moment. How does that fit with your story? Mm-hmm. It's exemplary of many other things. That's the first one. The second has to do with the world without Jews, and as you said, really Germany without Jews, because this fantasy of a world without Jews, or my country without Jews, was obviously not only German.
Right.
Poles had a fantasy of Poland without Jews. Ukrainians had a fantasy of Ukraine without Jews. And so what is the difference between the Polish or Ukrainian fantasy of a Jew-free, Pole-free Ukraine or Poland, and a German Jew-free, or a Jew-free Germany?
It's a very good question, because obviously the Nazis were not the only anti-Semites, and other people wanted their country without Jews. And I think I can give only a descriptive answer. I'm not so sure I have I think it's a really difficult question. my descriptive answer would start with politics. That in Germany on January 3rd, someone came to power who was powerful enough and obsessive enough. And he said, this is one of the main things that are important for me. I'm going to push this through. And within 6 to 8 weeks, he constructed a dictatorship. There were no more parties, no more free press, and this was so important for him that it was clear that either you join him or you shut up. I mean, it's not that you can have a pro-Jewish demonstrations. No. Of course, although I'm sure that if you poll Germans in 1934, 35, probably most of them would not want to kill the Jews, maybe would want some of them to emigrate, apart from my good friend in college, Heinz, who was a great guy, so let's keep him. And everybody has his own good Jew. But I think that, this will be the start of my answer, actually politics, not culture. Your question about the Talmud is very interesting because one of the dualities that I play in the book is that the Germans wanted to exterminate the Jews, but they didn't want to exterminate Jewish memory. Only they wanted to tell the story of Jewish history. So some scholars speak about memory side of the Jews. I understand it if you speak about it from the point of view of the Jews, but from the point of view of the Nazis, they were going to speak a lot about the Jews and about how they overcame historical evil. And that is why, as you know, Omer, at a certain point during the war, they start to collect Judaica from all over Europe. They burn a lot of things, and they collect Judaica. And so it just shows that even the Nazis were not masters of their own story. So at the end of the war, who saved the most important Judaica of the Jews? The Nazis. So this relation of killing the Jews as evil, but keeping their memory as told by the Nazis is, I think, part of the argument I'm trying to make of why the Jews were important. Because there was for the Nazis, some essential importance in some truth in Jewish existence, in Jewish history and memory that was worth exterminating and worth fighting against and worth setting the record straight that they did not have with other victims groups. And I think that this essential truth is to be found not in racial identity, I don't think so, but really in the rereading of the past. That's it?
Maybe last question.
Short.
Regarding identities of acknowledged racial identities, economic identities, and political identities, do you see a correlation in the experience of the Holocaust to what is happening in this country now in terms of an apparent reduction and eventual perhaps elimination of an entire class of economic people or political entities?
Look, I can think that we may want to think with a category of identities about the Third Reich, about present-day America, about all periods. This, yes. But I don't see any correlation, historical, comparative correlation between the Third Reich and the United States. God sei Dank. They say.
Thank you very much.